This little bag is made from just one long strip of fabric, and due to the construction, it lines itself. I did a tutorial for a larger version with a single drawstring, but I wanted to show you a version with self-closing drawstrings, which makes it a perfect little gift pouch. I'm going to cut a long strip off the bottom of this cotton fabric. After cutting off the slightly frayed edge, I'm cutting a strip that's 12 centimeters wide. I'm going to use up almost the entire width of the fabric. I'm just going to trim off most of the self edges. Leaving a little bit of the self edge is fine because it's going to fall inside the seam allowance. Now we do need a long strip of fabric, but this one's big enough for 2 pouches, so I'm going to cut it in half. After trimming the self edges, I was left with about 112 centimeters. Then when I cut that in half, I was left with a piece that was 56 centimeters by 12 centimeters. We need to find the center of the piece of fabric, so fold it in half and press a crease into the fabric. Then we're going to take the fabric fold and fold it towards where we're going to mark the seam allowance. We're going to sew this back with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then I'm pressing in another crease because this is where we're going to mark where the tunnel will be. Now that we have the crease, I'm going to move the fabric out of the way and mark the seam allowances. I'm just going to do the bottom seam allowance and the corners. Then I'm going to make a little mark in the center crease line so I can easily see that center line through my ruler. Then on each side of that marking, I'm going to measure 2 centimeters, and those 2 centimeters will leave a gap of 4 centimeters after sewing. Now that gap, we're going to use it as both the tunnel, but also to turn the bag right side out later on. If you find you have trouble turning the bag right side out because that gap is too small, or you want a slightly wider tunnel, you can easily make that gap 5 centimeters instead of 4 centimeters. I'm going to sew all around with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When I reach the part where the gap needs to be, I tend to do a couple of back stitches, then turn up the stitch length and keep sewing. Then when I reach the end, I do another couple of back stitches to secure the thread and then keep sewing. Find that the stitch line there helps me with the pressing later on. I do have to open it up with a seam ripper, but I don't mind. As you can see, I made a small marking just for the bottom and the corner, and it just gives a little bit more precision and ease when sewing. As I reach the gap on the other side, I do the same. So secure my thread, turn up the stitch length, secure my thread again, and then keep sewing at a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Then I trim off the thread tails and snip off the corners. Before I open up the gaps in the side seams that are going to form the tunnel, I'm going to press the seam allowance. Next, I'm going to use a seam ripper to open up the tunnel on both sides. And because we're not going to secure the seam allowance where the tunnel or the opening is, I'm going to give it a final press before turning. I'm using my bamboo point turner to poke out the corners and press the side seams. After a quick moment to poke out all the corners, I'm going to focus my attention on the side where the fabric fold is, because that's what's going to be visible on the outside. You can roll the fabric between your fingers to get a nice fold on the stitch line, but the bamboo point turner also really helps. You can run it along the seam line to push it towards the outside. And here's what happens if you don't pay enough attention when you're pressing your seams. As you can see, the fabric is folded on the fabric and not on the stitch line itself, and it just looks a little bit messy. So if that happens, you want to go in again, rolling the fabric between your fingers and give it another press. In the next step, the bag is going to come together. Pick up the bag at the tunnel and push the side we didn't press into the side we just pressed. The side we just pressed is going to be the outside of the pouch, and the side we didn't press is going to be the lining. Then use something pointy to push the corners inside each other, and then we're going to align the sides so we can create the tunnel. After pressing, we're going to sew at 2 centimeters from the edge of the tunnel. And the seam allowance inside that tunnel isn't secured, so if you find that to be a problem, you can always do a couple of hand-sewn stitches to secure it. It's just too small to put it under a sewing machine. Then we're going to sew at 2 centimeters from the edge of the tunnel, or about 3/4 of an inch. As it's quite a small project, I did a couple of back stitches to secure the thread when I got close to the edge of the tunnel. If the bag was bigger, it was easier to sew over the side seam, but here you sort of cross a little the little gap between the edges, and I thought back stitching was a good idea to give it a little bit more security. After cleaning up the thread tails and giving the bag a final press, I'm going to insert the cord to create the drawstrings. I'm using a 3mm braided cotton cord, but if you have like a thin ribbon, that's going to work too. You're going to need 2 pieces that are 36 centimeters long, and I'm going to use a loop turner, but you can use a safety pin to insert the cords. To create the self-closing effect, you want to make sure that the ends of each piece of string are pointing in the opposite direction. After you've inserted the cord, your bag is ready for a gift.